Justin Sung has been sharing study tips and learning science on YouTube for years. I had a great chat with him for a few hours in May of 2022 about learning science. I have consumed a lot of his content and agree with many of his points, but we follow radically different approaches, different philosophies, different psychologies, explanations for learning, and I feel many of the explanations and jargon he uses could be misleading or oversimplified, and sometimes on the edge of misinformation. As someone interested in the research, when he says something like, the studies show or research shows, I'm the kind of person that wants to go and read those studies. So when Justin said in a recent video that you need to upgrade the way your brain learns,
because it means that there is an alternative pathway here, which is instead of just compensating, you can actually just upgrade the way that your brain learns.
And the problem people have is their bad patterns of learning, but we can change these neural patterns.
But the good news is that you can change these neural patterns. You can literally rewire the way your brain learns to make it faster and better at learning.
Saying these things raise alarm bells and questions for me. Does he mean neural patterns are the same as habits? Is the brain the only place where learning happens? And many more questions like this, but the video is titled Neuroplasticity Explained. Rewire your brain to learn anything faster. So I assume neuroplasticity will be explained in some way, and that brain rewiring will be discussed. But he starts by saying our brain isn't wired to learn that efficiently to begin with.
But before I teach you how to do that more quickly, we actually first need to understand why our brain isn't wired to learn that efficiently to begin with.
And then later it says, learning is a really practical thing your brain is really good at doing.
Learning is a very practical thing that your brain is really, really good at doing. It's not really good at passing an exam.
I don't understand how our brain isn't wired to learn effectively, but it is really good at learning. It can't really be both. This is just one example of Justin using words quite freely in his explanations, which I feel creates confusion. Unfortunately, he doesn't discuss his philosophy much, so viewers need to make lots of assumptions. But he says, what we are asking our brains to do is not what it was built to do.
What we're asking our brain to do is not what it was kind of built to do.
So I assume when Justin says learning, he isn't talking about different organisms developing abilities and skills. He is talking about measuring human results on specific tests, typically from school, and argues our brains weren't built for that. But there are three issues I see here. First, now this one might sound semantical, but I don't think our brains were built by something. We evolved. I don't think Justin believes our brains were built by something either, but I don't know, and I do want to emphasize this because saying our brain was built could suggest we are like machines. But we're not machines. We are certainly very different. This is significant because the brain like a machine metaphor leads to many ideas which aren't accurate, and those ideas can lead to harmful metaphors and philosophies. Second, saying built can also suggest it is finished developing, which it isn't. Neuroplasticity, changes in our brain, happens. So we are continuously building our brain, if anything. Then third, I assume he is making a nature versus nurture argument here, saying we weren't wired right from birth to pass exams, which seems wrong. Exam results depend on far more factors than our brain wiring from birth. So his starting arguments that our brains are bad at learning and we are born with problems to do well on exams are both oversimplified. I would argue to the point of misinformation. We all learn well depending on the situation. We can all pass exams depending on the situation. The situation or context is what is important, but the context is missing from Justin's explanations. This is important because the rest of the video discusses 4 principles and 8 requirements for neuroplastic change. But our brain is always changing. That is neuroplasticity. And the 4 principles and 8 requirements already happen. That is our experiences of living in the world, the situation or context we are in. So what I feel he is really arguing for are study techniques. Saying not to do rote memorization and rereading, which is fine, but he argues people do these habits of learning, neural patterns, bad habits, because their brain has changed and adapted and is good at that stuff.
Their brain has changed and adapted and it's molded itself to be really efficient at this thing. It's just that the thing it got really good at is just this stuff.
But I'm not sure what Justin is trying to say here. Our brain doesn't store rote memorization. It is a social construct we have created to describe our behavior, but behavior goes well beyond our brain. To me, this is again oversimplifying learning as a brain-only process, referring back to the machine metaphor and our brain being a storage, a RAM center for everything, which is a philosophy challenged by most of cognitive science. And he then claims 20 years ago, no one would have been able to tell you this is how learning works.
20 years ago, no one would have been able to tell you this is how learning works because the research wasn't really there.
Which is odd for a couple of reasons. First, the research he references, like cognitive load theory, is 30 years old, so maybe he just misspoke and got the number wrong. But the ideas from information theory date back to the 1950s, which is when Miller's magical number 7 paper was published. That is often used in information processing theories of cognition, used in the working memory theories, which was then used in cognitive load theory. So his sources for frameworks and ideas for how learning works go back 70 years, not 20. You could argue they go further back, but I feel those ideas were less discussed in relation to learning science back then. And then second, we still don't know how learning works. We have lots of theories, hypotheses, and ideas, but loads of questions and disagreements on the explanations. Disagreements within modern information processing approaches, like the Bayesian brain hypothesis, active inference, predictive processing discussions, which often disagree with older information processing approaches, which many people still use, like schema theory. But there is also disagreement within the alternative approach, which I follow, the ecological approach. Then the 4 E's of cognition, embedded, embodied, enacted, and extended, have disagreements relating to how radical someone may go with their approach. This seems like another oversimplified claim, which I would argue is borderline misinformation. We don't know how learning works. Which, after Justin shares the 4 principles for neuroplastic change, he says, obviously, this is a gross oversimplification.
Obviously, this is a gross oversimplification. There's lots more complexity around learning than this.
Which to me is worrying for a couple of reasons. If something is grossly oversimplified, how accurate is the information? How useful is the information? But more importantly, how could the information be misunderstood or potentially misused? I recognise it is difficult to balance complexity when creating content and sharing ideas online, so I thought about the target audience of that video. People wanting to get better grades? Maybe. People wanting to learn how to learn better? Maybe. But I feel most people watching this kind of video are those interested in learning science. They are interested in the details, like me. So why grossly oversimplify? Principle 1, memory is a symptom, seems vague and inaccurate. Symptom suggests memory indicates a condition of disease or a problem, which memory certainly isn't. Lack of memory, maybe, but remembering is arguably learning, which happens through experiences. Empiricists Locke and Aristotle discussed this centuries ago, which forms the traditional assumptions of perception science, which I discussed up there, and by extension, the nature of knowledge. Principle 2, cognitive processes are more important than physical processes, begs the question, what counts as cognitive? And what is physical that isn't cognitive? Justin says what matters is what goes on inside of our brain.
So it doesn't matter if the way you write notes looks this way versus the way you read looks this way. What matters is what goes on inside your brain when you consume that information.
Then briefly expands by saying, what do you do with that? What thoughts do you have?
Once that information enters your eyes, enters your ears, and gets inside your brain, what do you do with that? What thoughts do you have about this information?
Again, I feel this is drastically oversimplified and hints at the dualism of mind and body, your mind being separate from your body. But this is rejected by the ecological approach, the approach I take, and most of modern information processing approaches to cognitive science. Most follow embodied cognition, rejecting the dualism, mind and body. So although interesting and potentially useful questions, the principle they come from isn't a principle. It isn't a fundamental truth or proposition. It is a statement which requires far more explanation, in my opinion, and comes from an idea many people reject. Then principle 3, integrative processes are superior to isolated processes, again isn't a principle. It is also wrong. Justin says we should think about the way that it relates to a bigger picture.
If you think about that in a way that's relating it to a big picture.
But if you want to learn an isolated skill, however we define isolated, you are better off practicing the isolated skill. If I want to learn to add single-digit numbers, I will practice by adding single-digit numbers, not multiple-digit numbers. Learning to catch one ball, I will throw and catch one ball. I'm not going to try and juggle 3 at once. Again, this is where I feel Justin leaves out the situation and the context in his explanations. Practicing the thing you want to get good at, or representative practice, is effective, but it depends on the context and the potential bigger picture. And I think principle 4 is that effort is good, but we need to expend energy, effort, to survive, so I assume he's referring to a threshold, an amount of effort which can be measured that is ideal. Justin says effective active learning takes more mental effort.
Effective active learning takes more mental effort, which makes sense because your brain is doing all of this integrative thinking.
Again, hinting at mental or a mind that does stuff, processing, but what about the body? The word effort can and does mean lots of different things. Effort can be expended but not related to the task, which could be seen as wasted effort, but could also be seen as variability, which can be functional. Learning to ride a bike on a balance bike is better than with training wheels because there is more functional variability developing the skill of balancing on a balance bike. Saying effort is good is, as he says, grossly oversimplified. I don't think these 4 principles are fundamental truths or propositions, so aren't really principles, and they don't go much deeper than saying, we learn from our experiences, which empiricists said centuries ago. They hint at effective behaviours for learning, but lack context and depth for application. And this is my main issue here. Oversimplification with lots of jargon. Justin says this is why the idea of teaching to a 10-year-old is especially effective.
This is why the idea of teaching to a 10-year-old is especially effective.
Saying that you need to organise your thoughts, which we do whenever we communicate, to varying degrees. We need to be logical and have a flow that makes sense, which again we do whenever we communicate with varying degrees, but then we also need to simplify it and make it accurate and comprehensive. However, one really important part here is missed. This is for the 10-year-old you are teaching. Once again, the context is just missed. Taking away the irrelevance of age, as every 10-year-old is a little bit different, and putting a level of expertise in there instead, someone with a very high level of expertise is unlikely to learn much about the topic, if anything, teaching it to someone with a very low level of expertise. Communicating ideas can be effective, but it depends on the context, the relationship between the organism, person, and their environment. When Justin discusses the 8 requirements for neuroplastic change, saying there are certain conditions you have to meet to make neuroplasticity work for you more effectively,
there's actually certain conditions that you need to meet in order to make neuroplasticity work for you more effectively. Otherwise, like I said, it's going to take you years and years and years.
Again, I'm assuming neuroplastic change means adopting different study techniques, more specifically, behaviours that seem to be more effective. But there isn't any mention of why, when, or how we behave in the world. Sensation and perception science, left out. Behavioural science, left out. Much of modern cognitive psychology, left out. I wouldn't expect ecological psychology to be included, as he follows cognitive psychology, but that is also left out. However, he says that when we have thoughts, they are going up and down this highway, which is on an axon he drew.
So when you have thoughts, they're going up and down this highway, and it terminates at this area called a synapse.
But an electrical impulse isn't a thought. Sensation science explains how sensation or a stimulation is changed from energy sources, vibrations, sound, touch, light, detected by our senses, then through transduction is converted into neural activity, the electrical impulses. But then we need to turn those electrical impulses into perception. That process, perception, being highly debated, direct, indirect, etc., but I don't know of any cognitive scientist that would say an electrical impulse is a thought. An impulse is part of the thinking process that we could describe as perception or action or cognition. Ecological terms are more process-driven, verbing the noun, so processing, acting, cognizing, but certainly not a thought on its own. Unfortunately, Justin doesn't include any sources, so I couldn't explore where this explanation came from, but I feel this is another example of gross oversimplification and borderline misinformation. I think Justin might be referring to the old schema theory when he says the pathways used are strengthened over time.
The pathways that are used more frequently are the ones that get reinforced and strengthened over time.
But as I discussed in a past video about Mike Israetel's arguments, schema theory has many issues and is rejected or has been drastically changed because of the issues. One of which being oversimplified explanations of how the brain works. And so when Justin talks about the 8 requirements, I feel like they are more like factors impacting human behavior, thus performance, not really saying much about neuroplasticity. The first requirement, intention, is present in all organisms' behavior. You could change this slightly to match goal-directed behavior, so Justin emphasizing the importance of having a task goal that points in a useful direction, but he says you should try to use the same pathways.
So that we try to use the pathways that we know are more beneficial, and therefore it means that they're more likely to be activated and strengthened over time.
We don't have control of the neural pathways used, the jargon in his explanation creating confusion in his argument for intention. The intensity requirement seems vague as, again, every behavior has a level of intensity. The example used is that going to a gym, lifting up a weight, and saying, "Am I strong yet?" is a poor question.
Because the intensity of that stimulus wasn't enough. It's kind of like going to a gym, lifting up a weight for 1 rep and being like, "Am I stronger yet?" No, not even a little bit.
This example lacks context of relative strength, measures of strength, and conflicts with the centuries-old assumption every scientist holds. We learn from our experiences, the empiricists Locke and Aristotle mentioned earlier. However, Justin does expand and says we need to calibrate the intensity so it is always challenging.
And a simple rule of thumb that I recommend is that you should calibrate the intensity so that it's always challenging.
So I assume intensity and the feeling of challenge mean kind of the same thing here. Justin relates this to the research from the zone of proximal development and, by extension, comfort zone and desirable difficulty. More intense work means more challenging. But again, this depends on the context or the relationship between the person and their environment. Sprinting is more physically intense than sitting down, but reading a complex text could feel as more challenging. The comparison of behaviors matter. Context matters. Saying we should do slightly different challenging things?
The most effective way of getting good at something and rewiring your brain is not to do the same challenging thing over and over again. It's to do slightly different challenging things over and over again.
Seems odd, as the world is filled with variability, variety. The ecological approach argues each experience is unique, and modern information processing approaches still embrace variability in their predictions for unknowns. As I mentioned earlier with the balance bike example, functional variability is useful, but his comments are also odd, as we can't do the same challenging thing over and over again, as the second time we do the task, it wouldn't be as challenging as the first. The third time, less challenging. So eventually it wouldn't be a challenging task. This is one of the reasons why the ecological approach emphasizes that each experience is unique. The person-environment relationship changes. But this requirement for variety hints at Justin's philosophy following the often rejected Fitz-and-Posner model for stages of learning: cognitive, associative, and autonomous. He says, when your brain starts operating on autopilot too early.
When your brain starts operating on autopilot too early.
Now, I assume by autopilot, he's referring to shortcuts or cognitive heuristics, the autonomous stage from the rejected model. But using shortcuts too early is grossly oversimplified. Too early for what? Compared to when? Or who? If you try something that doesn't work, is it because you used a shortcut too early? or because it is a different situation you haven't experienced before, more complexity, different factors, or different causes involved. The Fitz and Posner model is often rejected because it is too linear, oversimplifies learning, and uses the often rejected schema theory and ignores the role of the environment. The seemingly carefree use of words again creates confusion for me in Justin's explanations and arguments. Variety can be helpful, but again, it depends on the context. A practice design encouraging functional variability. Frequency as a requirement is very similar to saying you need to practice. The saying use it or lose it is popularized and can be helpful, but if taken literally, isn't accurate. Justin says, you know that they say once you learn how to ride a bike that you never forget? That is false.
You know how they say that once you learn how to ride a bike, you never forget? That's false. If you give it enough time, you will forget how to ride a bike.
Well, if you take it literally, of course it is false. It depends how and when you measure riding a bike, but also what happens between the measures. Damage of the body or the bike will change someone's ability to cycle. However, we develop abilities and they change over time. That's not a requirement, but a lawful process experienced by living organisms. What is a more effective frequency again requires context, which is lacking. Duration as a requirement is similar. It depends on the measures, which Justin does mention, but he says the research is very unclear about this.
And the research is very unclear about this. And so actually, rather than drawing on the research, I'm going to have to draw from my own personal coaching experience and what I've seen with the students that work through my program and in my coaching practice.
Which is another confusing statement for me. If we use the balance bike study already mentioned, 100% of the participants in the balance bike group learned to ride independently. So the research can be quite clear when the measure and situation are added, like learn X skill through Y process with Z types of people will take about some value to some value. When Justin says research is unclear, I don't know what he's referring to. Neuroplastic change is what I assume, adopting the study techniques, but behavior change, in the behavior science literature, has values and estimates. Then emotion as a requirement. Justin doesn't explain what emotion is, but says when an experience is more emotional, it leaves a bigger imprint on your brain.
Research says that when a experience is more emotional, this could be positive or negative, it leaves a bigger imprint on your brain.
But I don't think we can see any emotional imprint in our brain, nor point at memories in our brain, and I don't think we can point at emotions in our brain either. Humans' brains are active, assuming the person is alive or electrical impulses are being pushed through it, but electrical impulses aren't memories, emotions, or thoughts as mentioned earlier, especially in disconnected brains having electricity put through it. Memories and emotions are concepts, similar or part of perception. They require a conscious organism, however we want to define conscious, and memories also change, like a lot. Emotion is one of many concepts we use to describe factors that impact our ongoing experience and decisions. And with no references, I had to look to find any research on imprinted emotions in our brain, but I couldn't, apart from people saying they remember emotional experiences, but every experience is emotional with varying degrees. I feel emotion was included as a requirement, so he could talk about dopamine. As Justin says, dopamine is a happy hormone.
There is an element of emotion that you can and should tap into, which is the idea of trying to create a level of dopamine. Dopamine is the happy hormone.
He goes on to say dopamine directly reduces the threshold that you need to reach for neuroplastic change.
The chemical reason is that dopamine directly reduces the threshold that you need to reach for neuroplastic change to occur.
Which, as discussed before, neuroplastic change isn't really neuroplasticity, nor is it brain only. So what threshold is he referring to? And if we need lots of dopamine to get past that threshold, I assume he is suggesting other activities can help our learning meaning improved performance on school tests. But I don't think Justin would recommend playing video games or scrolling TikTok will help people pass tests. But they can boost dopamine levels. Again, the oversimplification and use of jargon creates confusion and borders misinformation and misuse of the guidance. Then sleep is a huge topic and gets very complex, especially when fatigue is included, and if you are extremely tired, then performance will decrease. But Justin says sleep-dependent memory consolidation moves things into a more retrievable part of the brain.
Does this thing called sleep-dependent memory consolidation, which is basically all the stuff that you've been cramming in, it actually moves that information into a more usable, retrievable part of the brain.
This was another red flag claim with no references. I went to have a look for some recent papers. This 2023 paper concludes by saying, although we identified a number of gaps in knowledge, the available evidence supports the notion that sleep promotes memory formation in an active systems consolidation process that is specifically established in the hippocampus-dependent episodic memory system. So sleep helps memory. And this 2004 paper was from Matthew Walker, the guy who wrote the popular sleep book, Why We Sleep, which has loads of errors and oversimplifications in it. But that said, in the end, the question appears not to be whether sleep mediates learning and memory consolidation, but instead how it does so. Again, saying sleep helps memory, and both papers discuss different brain activation levels during sleep, but nothing about more retrievable parts of the brain or moving memories at all. We aren't machines. We can't pick a memory out of our head like we can a file from a memory stick. Although the machine metaphor isn't mentioned at all, ideas from the metaphor seep through most of Justin's explanations. As for exercise as a requirement, Justin talks about BDNF, one of the key chemicals involved in strengthening pathways.
BDNF. It stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and it's one of the key chemicals that's involved in strengthening pathways, maintaining the brain, and pruning unnecessary pathways. And aerobic exercise actually seems to directly increase the expression of BDNF.
And although the research is interesting, it isn't significant. I don't like using a person as evidence, but Stephen Hawkins couldn't do aerobic exercise, especially to that extent. He had ALS, which limited his mobility, and he lived in a wheelchair for 40 plus years. His neural pathways seemed quite functional considering his massive contributions to science. From my perspective, I don't think neuroplasticity was explained in this video. I don't think rewiring the brain to learn faster was discussed in much depth either. And I understand the YouTube game and getting clicks and views, but when oversimplifications misrepresent research, sensationalized science, and jargon is used in ways that can create confusion or create potentially damaging philosophies, I wonder when we call something misinformation. Plagiarism was a hot topic on YouTube in 2023 with H-Bomber video. Various academics and creators discuss fake news all the time, but Justin is doing good. He is sharing his understanding of the literature he is familiar with, bringing visibility to ideas like many others do. I'm not much different, and this might just be me, but I would love to see more back and forth conversations with videos on YouTube from educational channels like this, similar to academic papers responding to alternative ideas. Drama YouTube does it all of the time, so maybe video essay and educational channels could do it a bit more. I personally would be interested to get Justin's thoughts on this critique of his video to move the conversation forwards. Could he share some of the sources and references that he didn't include in the description? Could he elaborate on some of the context that was missing and maybe discuss some of his behind-the-scenes philosophy of where the ideas come from? I haven't spoken much about the ecological approach in this video, but I think this video is a good place to start.